In this social media-driven digital world we live in, it's just so easy for somebody to say something stupid, somebody to do something inappropriate. It's just so easier than for my dad's generation. He was a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it was a different world back then. And this is really important. In fact, I would encourage you, don't just get the book for you. I'd get copies for your senior staff. I'd get copies for your elders or your board, because this is really vital stuff. And I've seen churches collapse because of a problem. In Alabama, just recently, a church secretary, the most trusted person on the staff, been there for 30 years. They just discovered she's embezzled almost $400,000 over the last 5 years from the church. And she's going to go to jail, but she can't possibly pay it back, so the churches had to close because they can't make it work. And they didn't realize it until somebody's check bounced. And they started looking at the bank account, and she's the most trusted person. Nobody could imagine she could ever do anything like that. But it happens more often than you think. So what I thought I would do is give you, just based on principles in the book, I can't go into great detail, but I thought today I'd give you 4 or 5 really key things about how to avoid a crisis at your church. And again, it could be from the outside. It could be from a kid who breaks his leg on the playground and his dad sues. It could be a cancel culture issue when the outside people put pressure on the church because they don't like what you're preaching. Or it could be self-inflicted, something on the inside that goes wrong, somebody that does something inappropriate. Whatever the crisis is, I want to give you 4 or 5 ways to try to avoid those situations. And then I want to give you a handful of things to do should you find yourself in one. Does that make sense? So let's start with 4 or 5 things that I think will help you completely avoid a crisis to begin with. Number 1 is understand the power of a glass door. This is going to sound strange, but years ago, I met a pastor in a great church in Chicago, and he told me he had a real burden for integrity with his team and his staff. And so when they remodeled their office building for their church, he put a glass window or a glass door in every single room in the building. He said, I just want to make sure there's no place for anybody to fool around. And I was so impressed by that. When we remodeled a building in Burbank for our media team a number of years ago, I did the same thing. In fact, I did both. I put a window and a glass door in every single room in the building, except the bathroom, of course. I put one in every room because I felt like, why do we want to allow a place where things could possibly go wrong? And a lot of people will tell me, well, Phil, if somebody's going to have an affair, if they're going to fool around, and they can't do it there, they'll just do it somewhere else. Actually, that's not true. I discovered in all the cases I've dealt with over the years, the vast majority start at work. You know, and think about it. You've got your team. You're working with your team intensely. Maybe there's one particular person on your team you're spending the most time with, late nights. One thing kind of leads to another. And I discovered if you could just open that office up, get that glass door in there, get the glass window in there so people see what's going on. And it doesn't hurt your privacy. I mean, you can have a private phone call in there, glass. People aren't going to hear what's going on in there. They're not going to hear your conversations, but they can see what's going on. Now, it's interesting that a lot of this came out of what we've called the Billy Graham rule. You've heard that term. In the last few years, it's been criticized quite a bit. It's actually called the Modesto Manifesto. Early in Billy Graham's career, he and his team decided they were going to have a list of rules that would guide them to live a life of integrity in ministry. And they did it when they were in Modesto, California, doing the crusade there. And one of the rules was they would never be in a room alone with a member of the opposite sex. Now, Billy Graham kind of mitigated that a little bit by having the door open so his secretary could look in the office and, always see what was going on. Now, it's rightly gotten some criticism because a lot of women feel like, well, wait a second, that means I can't have private time with a pastor, or I can't have private time with a boss. And if I can't have private time with a boss, I'm never going to move up the ladder. I'm never going to move up in my career. Guys can do it, but I can't. Guess what? The glass door solves that problem. The glass window solves that problem. You can have all the private time you want. Nobody's going to hear your conversation, but it keeps things from happening. So it may sound silly to some of you, but I can tell you, if I was you, first thing I'd do when I left this conference was go back and put glass doors in every room in my building. It's relatively cheap, and it can save you a world of hurt. I can't tell you the number of crisis situations I've dealt with where if that was the case, they would have never happened. Never, ever happened. The second thing I think I would encourage you to do is be more aware of red flags. Be aware of red flags. Red flags happen more often than we think, but we just don't pay attention. After all, we're churches. We're ministries. We're pastors. How could pastor ever be guilty of something like that? How could that youth leader that we just hired right out of seminary, man, he's full of the gospel. He's excited. What do you mean have an appropriate relationship? No, that's not going to happen. No way it's going to happen. But I'll tell you, I've seen red flags happen in more places than you can possibly imagine. And red flags come in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's that youth leader who maybe he's spending a little too much time with that one particular girl in the youth group. Or maybe it's that staff member who comes in every morning strangely looking like he's got a bit of a hangover. Or maybe it's the woman on staff who comes in with an awful lot of bruises. She says she stumbles a lot, but she's got a lot of bruises. There are red flags all around us, but we don't pay attention. One of my rules is when I'm in the middle of a crisis, when I'm working with a church, helping them get through a crisis, at that moment in the heat of the battle, I don't worry about what caused the crisis. I don't worry about how it happened. I worry about, let's get through this. Let's solve the problem. But then after it's over, I'll always bring the team back and I'll sit down and say, guys, looking back over the last 2 years, knowing what you know now, are there any red flags you probably should have noticed? I'll tell you, in every single case, they always say, oh yeah. Now I understand why he did that. Now I understand why she was doing that or saying that. Red flags happen all around us, but we just rarely ever notice. So, and I would say, be careful not to be too zealous. We're not here to be cops, behavior cops, because a false accusation can destroy lives. False accusation can destroy a church, but I would just urge you to be a little bit more alert when it comes to red flags. So often, we don't think about it, but they're out there and they happen more often than we think. Now, a third thing, a way to avoid a crisis is how do you deal when you get a email, text message, or a phone call from an admirer? Now, trust me, pastors, if you've been in ministry very long, you've probably received this. I spoke at a big ministry conference in South Africa a number of years ago, and probably a month after I got back, I got a letter, an email from this woman who had attended the conference. She was beautiful, and her email was quite provocative. And so I showed it to my assistant, and I said, why don't you respond to her? So my assistant responded to her, and once the lady found out my assistant sees all my emails, we never heard from her again. Never heard from her again. And by the way, that's a rule. I've got 3 people in my office, actually 4, have total access to my emails. They have total access to my calendar. When I come back from a trip, I give my receipts, my travel receipts and expenses to my assistant who catalogs them. She gives them to our producer who organizes them by client or who we should bill. Then they go to our CPA. I got 3 levels of people checking out my receipts. So I got people looking at my email, my calendar, my receipts. It'd be hard for me to arrange something inappropriate with that many eyeballs looking at what I do every day. I would encourage you, if that's not the case with you, consider it. Consider it. The minute they find, and by the way, let me say this. There's sometimes we'll get an email maybe that we're just not sure. Maybe it's innocent. Maybe she's just a little overenthusiastic, or it could come from anybody. Maybe they're just overenthusiastic or naive. I still say have your assistant respond. Because if the assistant responds and says, Pastor is busy this week preparing his new sermon series, and he asked me to respond because he's so grateful for your email. If it's innocent, they'll be thrilled. They'll be thrilled. But if it's not innocent, chances are they're not going to respond again because they know multiple people are looking at your emails. And let me say this real quick, just having done this so many times. Don't ever respond yourself. Because in a court of law, even if you respond negatively, even if you say, look, I don't want to be a part of this, or don't respond, don't email me anymore, in a court of law, they can make that look like you encourage the conversation. So my advice is, if you get a questionable email like that, don't respond. And if it's really, really out there, show it to your attorney, show it to your wife, show it to your assistant. And probably if anybody responds, have the assistant respond. Does that make sense? It's a bigger deal than you think, because it's how so many things get started. And by the way, be careful with your emails. Be careful with it. We don't think about this enough. Google has said that even if you delete an email, they don't ever really delete it. It's still on their server. And guess what? It can be called up in a court of law. Your text messages will be called up in a court of law. My advice is, if you don't want If you do an email that you don't want to be read publicly, don't send it. Don't write it. You know, I have my CPA, I'll call him, I'll email him a question about finances. He'll always say, give me a call, we'll talk about it. Give me a call, we'll talk about it. So be very, very careful because, and here's the other thing. If you send an angry, critical email to somebody, you know, or you talk about, say I send an email to Rusty because I'm mad at Dwayne. And I send a really nasty email about Dwayne to Rusty. Well, guess what? The minute I hit send, I've lost control of that email, and now Rusty has it. Maybe 6 months from now, Rusty's not my friend, and he's got that email. So be very careful with email. It can really destroy your reputation quicker than we possibly think. Now, the last thing I would say is really, this is a very interesting thing about how to avoid a crisis. I've discovered in all the cases I've ever dealt with over the years, and that's a lot of them, that there are 6 behaviors that are happening in most of those cases, almost all of them. And not all 6 are in play, but there are 6 particular things that I find at least 1 or 2 of them are almost all happening in the life of a person who experiences a moral failure, does something inappropriate, does something illegal, almost always. So I just want to tell you those 6 because if you could get a handle on these 6 behaviors, you're not going to believe how much of this we'd snuff out, we'd stop. Here's 6 things that 1 or more of these are always in play when I encounter a leader or a church or a ministry that's failed in some way. Number 1 is abusing alcohol and or sleeping pills. Now, I know you're pastors, you don't drink, right? Guess what? There's a surprising number of pastors who drink. And personally, I don't think the Bible prohibits alcohol. But if you're a pastor or ministry leader, I can give you a lot of reasons why you should be very, very careful, why you should probably avoid it altogether. And if you do choose to drink, do it in the privacy of your home. Do it with your spouse. Do it with somebody you trust. I've seen so many cases that started out innocently, but got ugly really, really quickly. I know one case of a pastor that young guy, blowing and going. His church was exploding, doing great. He had a real gift for preaching. People started noticing. They started asking him to come and preach at their conference, their church. And he would go out and do this, and he was doing great. And he'd come to the hotel at night after speaking at a church or a conference and, all wired up. You know what that's like. So we decided to go to the hotel bar and have a drink just to calm down. Well, guess what? Late at night at a hotel bar, there's a lot of attractive women there. And he'd start a conversation. One thing led to another, which led to another, and today that promising ministry leader is selling insurance. He had to walk away from ministry because he got caught. In fact, you know how he got caught? He got caught because he tried to pick up a girl at the bar who had just been to the church service he spoke at. Big mistake. And she went back and told her pastor, "You're not going to believe this, but this guy just tried to pick me up who preached at our church last night." He never preached again. So just be very careful. And I'll tell you, sleeping pills are just as bad, possibly worse. When you look at stories of leaders who fall, somehow sleeping pills come into the story at some place sooner or later. And the brand name that comes up most often is Ambien. Have you heard of Ambien? I'm sure there's appropriate uses for Ambien, but that brand keeps coming up with guys that, pastors that wander into the wrong hotel room, with pastors that say inappropriate things in a text message to a staff member. That just keeps coming up. I know when I was young, in my 20s, we were filming a big project, and we had been filming for weeks in the U.S., and I was completely exhausted, and we had to go to Israel to finish filming. And so my doctor said, "Man, you need to rest." He said, "Let me give you a prescription for Ambien." I don't know what it was. I knew it was a sleeping pill, but I didn't know, any of the legends. And so we get on the plane to Israel, my wife and I pop an Ambien. Well, when we got to Brussels, Belgium, to change planes, it was everything Kathleen could do to drag me off the plane. I mean, I was a carcass. She just dragged me off the plane, took me to the airline lounge, and dumped me on a sofa, and she went shopping in the airport for an hour while we waited for the next flight. I've never taken it again. I never took it since. And it scared me. It scared me. And I've dealt with so many cases of leaders who were taking Ambien or taking some other sleeping pill. So I would just say, really be careful. Take a melatonin Get a little exercise, try anything, but I would avoid the sleeping pills at all costs. You never know how it's going to react. In so many cases that happens. The next thing I would say that's a problem is crude or sexualized joking with staff members. Now, obviously you don't do this, but you know what? It's awfully easy to step over that line. You've got a team that you're intimate with, you're friends with, you've been around for a long time, and you're occasionally, you got a funny joke that, well, maybe it's not really dirty or anything, but it just kind of steps across the line. Maybe it's just inappropriate. I was actually at a church one time, a very large church on the East Coast. Very large church on the East Coast. They had asked me to come on board and help them, consult with them to help them with their media outreach. They were about to launch a television program. And they invited me to a staff meeting one day, and there's about 12 people in the room. And I'm in this staff meeting, and suddenly the pastor, while we're getting ready for the meeting to start, the pastor starts joking with some of the girls in the room about what color underwear they're wearing. And he said, well, now, Cindy, you look like a pink underwear girl. I bet you're wearing a pink bra right now, right? I'd put money on the fact. And Judy, you're probably black lingerie girl, right? I bet you're wearing black panties right now. I mean, I was stunned. I grabbed the executive pastor, I jerked him out in the hallway and said, what in the heck just happened in there? What's going on? And he said, oh, it's no big deal. The pastor's a jokester. Everybody knows he likes a good joke. It's not a problem. Well, guess what? It was a problem because 3 months later, he was forced to step down because of an affair. And I've discovered over and over again that kind of crude, sexualized, and trust me, I'm not a prude. If you know me, well, I'm certainly not a prude. I push that boundary a lot, but you have to be really, really careful. If you've ever seen what I post on Instagram, you'll understand what I mean. You should see the file on my computer of things my wife won't let me post on Instagram. So I'm always pushing that boundary, but you have to be careful. I've just seen it over and over and over, how something started with just crude joking among who we thought were our friends and staff members. You just never know. And in fact, there's one pastor in Texas here that I dealt with who actually, a lady in his congregation sent him a funny joke. And he responded to her, because they were friends. He responded to her with something that was a little over the line. It wasn't dirty, it was just a little inappropriate. She printed it out, took it to the board, took it to the elders, and said, these are the kind of jokes your pastor shares with women in the congregation. He was fired within 24 hours. And that was his dream church. That was a dream a church he'd worked years to get on this church. And he was fired within 24 hours. You just never know. So just be very, very, very careful. Another behavior is spending too much time away from your spouse. Now, I know ministry leaders that literally travel the world ministering to people, and they travel by themselves. They never take their wife or their husband, ever. Now, in their defense, it's not always because they're a jerk or they like to be alone. Many cases, they're married to someone who doesn't like to travel. Maybe it's a wife who wants to be with the grandkids. Or maybe it's just a homebody, somebody that just doesn't like to travel very much. It's true of men and women both. But I'll tell you, on a trip like this, like I came down here yesterday afternoon late, had dinner with some of you guys last night, and I'm leaving this afternoon to go home. On a trip like this, 1, 2 days, maybe 3 at the most, I'll come by myself. But if it's longer than that, I'm taking Kathleen with me. I've just seen too many cases where being alone was not a good thing. I had one evangelist tell me one time, Phil, I've discovered that when the hotel maids start looking good, it's time to go home. And I thought, you know what? You should have been home long before the maids started looking good. That's all I'm saying. Be very careful about that. So, and if you can't travel with your wife, if she won't or he won't, whoever, travel with a trusted staff member of the same sex, obviously. Travel with them because that accountability really does matter. It really does matter. Be very sensitive. And remember, we live in an age where, I was thinking about this at dinner last night. When I went back to my hotel last night, anybody, whether they were there or not, could have said, I met Phil at that Marriott Courtyard Hotel, and we sat at the bar for a few hours and went up to his room. I would have no way to prove that didn't happen. You can't prove that didn't happen unless your spouse is with you or a trusted associate is with you. So think about that when you're on the road by yourself. I've seen so many disasters. I mean, one pastor had a lake house, and he was working on a new book, so he would go to the lake house during the week and not allow his wife to join him. Well, guess what? Apparently somebody else showed up at the lake house, and they had an affair, and he was forced to step down. So being apart from your spouse is a real red flag, a real indicator. Another quick thing, I don't want to take too long here, is a fascination with porn. Now, a lot of you will be shocked, but you'd be stunned at the number of cases I've dealt with where pastors were downloading porn on their office computer. Staff members were downloading porn on their office computers. Youth leaders were downloading porn on their office computers. One of the most famous evangelists in America was one news source reported that up until his death, he was frantically deleting photos from his phone. Porn is a bigger issue than we think in the church today. And a lot of it is because of social media. It's so easy to access on Twitter, on Instagram. There's so many ways to access pornography today that it's a huge problem. If you don't have porn filters on your office computers, you're living a dangerous life. I would encourage you, when you go back home, have filters put on your office computer. You can't control what people do at home, but I would teach on it. And I would definitely put those filters on at the office because it's just so easy to access. And it's come up in so many cases of leaders, pastors that you know, and you'd be shocked to find out they were viewing porn on a pretty regular basis. So it's a bigger issue than we think. And another thing is something I call really stupid decisions. RSDs. And I'm going to tell you, you think these guys are smart. You think these leaders are smart, and they theoretically are, but you cannot imagine the number of really stupid decisions that happen out there. Who thought that the leading apologist in the church today, one of the top evangelists, brilliant thinker, who would have thought it was a good idea for him to own a chain of massage parlors? One pastor, very highly celebrated pastor, invited his assistant to move into his house with he and his wife so he could be more productive. So they could work together all the time. Well, they worked together on things other than his sermons. And he was forced to step down. One pastor would have a few drinks at night and then get on social media and start ranting about stuff. He'd get hammered, and he had a huge church. He would get hammered, go online and start ranting about things. Really stupid decisions. People think, in retrospect, we think, what an idiot. But at the time, I don't know why more people don't speak up. People don't speak up. But it happens. It happens. And I would encourage you to create a culture of not just accountability, but it's going to lead to my next point, which is most of this happens in an environment or a culture where nobody questions the leader's decisions. Now, in the leader's defense, this is not always because the leader's a jerk. Certainly, I know pastors and some ministry leaders who are pretty much dictators, who it's my way or the highway. I do know a few like that. But in the vast majority of cases I've encountered, it's actually out of respect that the staff doesn't question the boss's decisions. Let's go back to that guy that was guessing women's underwear, the color of women's underwear. After that, I looked back on that meeting, and I was thinking about the 10 or 12 people that were in that room, and I realized every single one owed that pastor a deep, deep spiritual debt. More than half of the group had been saved, led to Christ through his ministry. At least a couple, their marriage had been saved and put back together because of his ministry. One guy in the room had been through the drug and rehab program that the pastor founded, that the church sponsored. So sitting there, I'm thinking, those guys owed him a deep, deep debt. So they're not going to call him out. This is my spiritual father. I'm not going to call him or her out. Now, I'm a secular guy. I work in the film business, the media business. My team has no qualms about calling me out on stuff. In fact, they regularly call me a moron. They have absolutely no issues with telling me, hey, Phil, that's not a good decision. We need to rethink this. We need to have that culture in the church as well. Now, it doesn't mean they're not respectful. They need to be respectful. They need to be humble when they do it. But if I was you, I would start teaching my team about, look, I want to know if you think I'm making the wrong decision here. I want to know if you think I'm doing something inappropriate. Pull me aside. Let's talk about it. They don't need to be a jerk about it, but they should come to you and say, look, and you should support that. There's so many cases where I've seen really stupid decisions tank a place because nobody was afraid to talk to the boss about it. So here's the thing. Let's look at this real quick. Abusing alcohol or sleeping pills, crude or sexualized joking with office staff, spending too much time away from your spouse, fascination with pornography. Really stupid decisions, and nobody questions the leader's decisions. Now, here's the thing. Of these 6 things, these types of behavior, 1, 2, or more are pretty much in play in every single crisis I've encountered at a church. Every single one. So that means if we could get our handle on this, if we could get control of these areas, we could save a lot of destroyed lives and a lot of damaged churches. Make that a priority list. Okay, now, having said that, let me give you just a handful of things if you do get caught in a crisis, what to do. In a minute, I'm going to finish early enough, hopefully, that we'll be able to do some Q&A, and if you have any questions, we'll talk about them. But I know this is a slog, but this stuff is so incredibly important. If you've seen what I've seen out there, and by the way, I saw a statistic recently that 27% of people who have left the church entirely, left the gospel entirely, leave because of the way their church handled a crisis. I have a friend in LA that was crazy about Hillsong. She loved that church. The LA church, she was crazy about it. But the minute those scandals started falling like dominoes, she's walked away from the church entirely. She wants to have nothing to do with it. She's completely turned her back on the gospel, which means if we could solve these issues, we'd save 1/4 of the people leaving the church today. We'd stop that exodus, which would be absolutely significant. So let me give you a handful of things that if you get caught in a crisis, and like I say, it's probably going to be when it happens, not if it happens. Here's some things I'd recommend. Number 1, be prepared. Now, in my book, Church on Trial, I have a whole plan in there about what you need to know if a crisis happens. So it's another reason why you need to get your hands on the book and go through that crisis plan. I don't have time to go through it, but research indicates organizations that have a plan weather the storm far better than organizations without a plan. Organizations that are blindsided don't do well. But if they have a plan in place, know how to respond, know how to react, they always come out better. The second thing is your first call should be to an attorney. And this is really important. There are so many liabilities today, you can't even believe it. Reporting is a good example. When it comes to minors, if there's an issue with a minor in your church, there is no wiggle room. There's no gray area. You have to report that to authorities now. In earlier days, 20, 30 or more years ago, those laws were still being formed and put together, and pastors didn't know. Nobody talked about this in seminary or Bible college. They didn't understand. And what we're seeing now is a lot of pastors being accused 30 years after the incident simply because they didn't report it. You may remember Brian Houston. That was the reason for the trial in Sydney last year. His father, Frank, was a known pedophile. That's no secret. Brian's preached about it before. His father was a registered known pedophile, and a young boy he had abused many, many, many years ago. The family actually came and said, look, we don't want to report it because we don't want to ruin his school. We don't want to ruin his career. We don't have to move to another city. Just don't report it. Let's keep it between us. And they did. Well, now, 30 years later, the kid's grown saying, I didn't want you to keep that secret. And now he's suing. He sued. Now, Brian won that case. And here's the thing. It was Brian being sued even though he didn't have anything to do with it. It was his father that committed the crime. Likewise, there's a church I know in the Midwest here who the pastor came within a hair's breadth of going to prison because a staff member accosted a minor in a stairwell at the church, abused her, molested her, and the pastor didn't report it. The abuser went to jail. The pastor almost joined him. So an attorney can tell you when we need to report things and who we need to report them to. Put them on speed dial. And I would encourage you to find an attorney in your area. And if you don't know one, email me and I'll send you one. Find an attorney that knows how to deal with these kind of issues, just to have them on standby, because they can make a dramatic difference for you. There's so many liabilities out there, so many things for, encourage lawsuits. And the second call I would make is to a communication person. And I'll tell you why. I'm not just pitching for what I do for a living, but the reason that's important, an attorney will keep you out of jail. A communication expert will help save your reputation. Now, that doesn't mean you're lying, you want to lie about anything, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it means how you tell the story is just as important as the story you tell, remember? That's important. And I've seen some cases where a church or a ministry went to court and they won their case, but their reputation was trashed in the process. So you have to be careful about how you tell that story and how you release that story. So always get the advice at how you release a statement, how do you tell the congregation? There's so many issues like that. So that's important. The next thing I would do is be honest and don't cover up anything. Don't cover up anything. It will always come back to bite you. And we'll think, I'm just trying to protect the church. I'm trying to protect the family. I'm trying to protect this person or that person. No. Never cover anything up. We live in a transparent culture. I tell leaders, the minute you drive out of this conference, you get in your car, pull out on the highway out there, somebody T-bones you, you're going to be mad. You're going to jump out of the car and start yelling at that guy. Trust me, somebody will be on the curb filming it with their phone. And that'll be online within 12 hours, maybe within 1 hour. We have to be very careful and live transparent lives. So don't cover anything up and be honest. Now, you don't have to tell everything. Remember, I remember in Acts when Peter was telling the disciples about what happened to Judas after the crucifixion and how he committed suicide. Peter did not hold anything back, but he didn't go into gory detail. He could have gone into a lot more detail than he did, but he didn't. He just told them the facts about what happened to Judas and what they needed to know, and that was it. So you always be honest with what you know at the time, but be careful about going too far. Does that make sense? I hope so. Next thing I think you need to be aware of is get counseling or seek healing for everybody involved. Whether it's an accuser, whether it's an abuser, whatever, even early on when you don't know who's guilty and who's not. There's been a couple high-profile cases you probably will recall in the last couple years of pastor or ministry leader who was accused of sexual impropriety. And it was so weird because none of us could have believed this guy could have ever done these things. These were paragons, people that we really respected. And so the church in one case and the ministry in the other case started to go after this girl who had made the accusation. And they vilified her. They did everything they could to make her look bad, make her look wrong, and they circled the wagons to protect the pastor, only to find out within about 5 or 6 months, in both cases, she was right. She was right. And it was so humiliating. In the church case, the entire elder board resigned. Most of the staff were forced to resign. And in the ministry case, the ministry just crumbled. So, look, even if you think she's wrong or he's wrong, offer help. Offer counseling. You want to look like, and this is important because it's genuine, you want healing to happen to everybody. Whatever happened, you'll figure out what happened eventually. This is going to come out, but never at any point start vilifying or criticizing one of the parties. Even if it's a person on your staff that's being criticized that you love and you trust and you believe 100% in that man or woman, always be be Switzerland. Help both sides, if that makes sense. I think that's very, very important. And probably the last thing I would say, if the allegations turn out to be true, particularly if this is a senior pastor or a top leader, immediately, if not sooner, get rid of everything that guy's done. Get their books out of the bookstore, get their sermons offline. The reason I say that is that your critics will come back and use that material to make fun of your church, to criticize you, criticize your ministry. Get it offline. Get it offline. Shut down the social media, the man or woman's social media platforms. You don't want, and you want their stuff out of the church because you don't want to remind your congregation of this crisis over and over. You don't want to keep thinking of the man or woman who did the wrong thing. Get rid of all that stuff. It's very, very important. Now, let me say one important thing about this subject real quick, and that's sex offenders. Sex offenders, if you haven't had any come to your church yet, you're going to. The sex offender registry has exploded. I went onto it in my area of LA, Burbank, I typed in my zip code. I was shocked at the number of people within a mile of my house that are registered sex offenders. Absolutely shocked. Now, I'm in LA, so chances are it's higher than it may be here or someone else. But I'm just going to tell you, if you type your zip code into the sex offender registry, and you can find it online, it's easy to go to, you'll be amazed at the number in your area. And they're going to start coming to church. And honestly, we want them to come to church. We want them to get healing. We want God to transform their life. However, we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful. So some things I would just say about sex offenders is train your team to be vigilant. There's a church, this just happened I think a year or two ago in Chicago, where a couple ushers happened to notice that this new visitor seems to be really preoccupied with looking at the kids in church. He's really staring at these kids a lot. And so they went up to him and introduced themselves to him, found out his name, looked him up. Sure enough, he's a registered sex offender. I mean, bravo for them. They were on it. They were paying attention. Now, this is not to castigate or ridicule or demean him. However, they have committed a crime and they need to be held accountable for that. So you need to have an agreement with them. Sit down if necessary, and some pastors even advocate for a written agreement. And I've got some resources in the book that'll really guide you through some of these things, but they can't be around kids. You know, if it's a guy, they can't be involved in helping women's ministry. You know, there's certain boundaries, just like in the real world, they have to obey. They can't be near a school. Don't be afraid because you're a pastor or a ministry. Don't be afraid that, we should try to help him and, we want him to heal. And you know what? They've broken the law. They need to learn to live with limitations. So don't be afraid to do it. Now, let me say this, though, in respect to the registry. It's such a wide thing. It encompasses, it goes all the way from, guys who are hardcore child predators who are evil incarnate, all the way to two high school kids that, decide to have sex, and the minute one of them turns 18, boom, he's become a predator. He's become a registered sex offender. They're not the same. Some people want to genuinely be healed and transform their life. Others, not so much. So you do have to be attentive. And like I say, they're going to start coming to your church if they haven't already. And so you just have to be aware. Just have to be aware because that can protect you from a world of pain and a world of hurt. So let me just give you two final thoughts. And then maybe we'll open up for some questions. I know this is painful, isn't it? But I'm telling you how important this is. Two final thoughts. Number one, I want to destroy the myth that because I had an affair, because I cheated on my wife, now I'm a better leader because I know how to minister to people who've gone through that. Now, this is not the place to talk about can you be restored. There's arguments on both sides. Can you ever be restored to ministry? Can you go back into ministry? That's not a discussion for this moment, but I'll tell you this. I know too many leaders who have tried to take a shortcut by saying, I don't need to go through all that restoration stuff. Now that I've been through adultery and cheated on my wife, I'm really sensitive to that, and I can really help people who have been through that. So I'm actually a better leader because of it. I'm ready for ministry again. One word, bull. That is total bull. Never let anybody tell you that. C.S. Lewis probably said the best quote about that. He said, "Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of a wind giving up." A leader who has failed morally needs to go through that tough counseling, restoration process. Whether he's eligible to ever be a ministry leader again, I'm not going to argue that here. But don't ever let them take a shortcut. Don't ever let them say, I'm a better leader because I've sinned. No chance. Not a chance. The second thing I would say is we need to raise the bar when it comes to marriage in church. We really need to raise the bar. It's interesting that over the last 10 years, we've done some amazing things with singles ministry, and I'm thrilled with that. I think that's so important. But in the process, many churches have kind of lagged behind really ministering to married couples. And I'm going to tell you, I know every church I've worked with, when the pastor and his wife do a marriage seminar or they do a sermon series on marriage, it's the most popular thing they do all year. So people are hungry for this. Hungry for this. So I would say a couple things. Make biblical teaching on marriage a regular part of your ministry. Don't be afraid of it. Just because you have singles in your church, don't. Too many pastors I know say, well, I don't want to sidetrack the singles by talking about marriage all the time. You know what? Give them something to aspire to. Teach your people that marriage matters. The second thing is view married couples on your staff as a team. As a team. I'm on the board of the Salvation Army, and they view Army officers as a husband-wife team. In every case, they're both Salvation Army officers. If one gets promoted, they both get promoted. If one gets reassigned, they both get reassigned. They are considered a team. Now, that doesn't mean you take the cheap way out and make him or her work for free, make the spouse work for free, but view them as a team. View them as a team because it really does make a big, big difference. I would also say if wherever your budget can allow, if a staff member has to travel, particularly for something extensive, send the wife, send the husband, send the spouse. Be supportive of that effort. It really makes a difference when you can possibly do it. In my 20s, I worked for a major national ministry that would never pay for my wife to travel with me. Never. And I went all over the world filming stuff. And I vowed when I left that, I would never allow that to happen again. And even if we go in debt, I'm going to pay for her to come. I don't want to, number one, I don't want to get to be an old guy and have us have no memories. But number two, I just want her there. I just want her there. It's so incredibly important. And I would say this, another reason that I think it's important, if you look at all the hot button issues in our culture today, all the major hot button issues, marriage, family, gender, identity, sexuality, those are the biggest hot button issues in our culture. So what if we as a church became the one place in America that has amazing marriages, that has incredible families? I really believe that non-believers would look at us and think, I don't know about that Jesus business. I don't know about that whole Christian thing, but I want that marriage. I want that kind of family. I really think in the world we live in today, with the hot buttons and the culture that they are, I think building a marriage-focused church could be the best evangelism tool you could possibly create. Because I think, look at the statistics. This is the loneliest generation in the history of our country. They need something to aspire to. If we focused on building amazing marriages, I think it could be the most important thing we could possibly do. Okay, any questions out there? How do you want to do this, Rusty? You want to ask, or what do you want to do? I know this is a tough slog, but gosh, I can't tell you how, when you see the things I've seen, you just can't believe how important this stuff really, really is.
Because we are taping all of this, we want to make sure that you use a microphone, and that'll be recorded. But I know there's got to be a ton of questions. You've heard a lot, and he's only touching on just a small portion.
Yeah.
So everything media related, but as you're sitting out there, you're thinking these things and having these thoughts. This is the best time to ask, because if you ask him later, you have to pay for him.
That's true.
That's expensive. True. It costs a lot of money to bring a guy in like
you got me cheap.
You have a problem.
You got me cheap.
So fix it before you have the problem. And so, Tyler, raise your hand. Tyler will come bring a mic to you. So who has the first question?
Oh, boy. Dwayne, you should be concerned.
No, mine's easy. Is there a certain filter for churches or software computers that you recommend?
You know what? There's 4 or 5 major ones out there, and what I'll do is a little research, and I'll get back to you, and maybe you can shoot an email to everybody with what my recommendations would be. That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Anybody else?
Oh, boy.
So we dealt with an issue with a volunteer leader that was sending some messages through Instagram where they disappear.
Right.
And then we started to hear reports from people in the 20-somethings crew in our church that some things were happening.
Right.
And so we started to pursue these people to say, like, we please tell us everything that happened. But what we found was that some of them, they were either too hurt or whatever, and they didn't want to talk to us. And so we tried pursuing them. I'm just curious what advice you would give us in that kind of case when you have people who who aren't, just don't want to come forward. They don't want to talk to you about that?
Yeah. A couple things. One is very often an outside person will get more information from them than an inside person. We do a lot of focus groups with churches who want to, grow their media ministry, and they want to find out who's in our community and what do people think of our church and those kind of issues. And we've always discovered that they'll talk to us, be a lot more frank with us, outsiders, than they will be from people in the church. We even did a focus group with one church where we brought in church members, and we'd have new members that hadn't been there that'd been there for less than a year, older members that had been there for 20 years or more, young people, old people, a mix. And the things they told us were amazing, but they'd never told that to the staff. And so sometimes outsiders will help just because they don't want you to hold it against them. They're really concerned what you'll think of them if they tell you the truth. So sometimes bringing in somebody from the outside to do those kind of questions can really make a difference. And of course, how you word the question matters too. You never want to make them feel like they're part of the problem, or they could be investigated. You're just really concerned about what's going on. So I don't know if there's a magic answer to it, but that would help.
One comment, then a question.
Okay.
Comment is, well, first of all, so helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's all right.
So, a resource that we happen to use at the Abbey Church is called ministrysafe.com. It's a group of lawyers that defended abused children that were Christians, developed a whole training system for all of your volunteers to try to help the church prevent it. They had represented so many victims, they said, we've got to get on the other end of it.
That's great.
And create something new. So it's real simple, ministrysafe.com. It's an annual fee, comes with videos to train all of your people.
That's great. And I would say vetting employees is important too. I had one church call me recently that they were about to hire a youth leader. Great reputation, stellar resume, right about to hire him. And some girl called the church who said, I'm an OnlyFans model. OnlyFans, that nude site where you can pose nude and people subscribe. She said, he subscribes to my site. And guess what? That interview didn't go through well. So, yeah, vetting is very important.
Then one question.
Please.
Kind of back to the communication issue and with social media, direct messaging. I know that there is one pastor in our Metroplex that had an issue with that. Do you have recommendation for communication policy for staff
Yes.
and leaders?
In the book, I actually have a communication policy. I have a chapter on that subject, and I have a policy you can just cut and paste or adapt to your situation. I don't always, it's not a requirement that you have a social media policy, but I think a big part of what it does is it allows you to bring your team together and say, we're all going to sign this. Because here's the thing, your youth leader, your senior leader, whoever, they may have their personal social media accounts, but people know they work for the church. So if that youth leader is joking about getting drunk at spring break in Daytona Beach, guess what? That reflects on the church. And so you may not convince them of that, but it's true. They know that he works for the church, or that media guy, or that youth leader. And you never know where this will happen. It's almost difficult to say, but I worked with a church one time that hired a senior adult pastor. He was a retired minister, been a senior pastor his whole career. He was in his 60s now. He was retired, and they wanted a great senior adult pastor at their church. It was a big church. They brought him on, again, stellar resume, great recommendations. 6 months in, they discovered he'd been having a Facebook conversation with a girl he thought was a 13-year-old. And he arranged to meet her an hour outside of town, only to find out that it had been a cop the whole time. So they arrested him on site. And of course, they didn't tell the church. Nobody told the church. But all the media was there. The sheriff's office told all the media in the area, but they didn't mention it to the church. And so you just never know where these things will come from. That's why you have to be so very careful in these situations.
Well,
Sorry.
I've got a question for
Okay.
you. A lot of these things are being caught, but my question is there a forensic company or somebody that does like before you hire somebody? or
Yes.
something? Is there
Yeah,
somebody
there's a
that-
number. In fact, I may come up with a whole list of resources. I have them in the book, but like vetting.com, there's a site called vetting, vetting.com, that will do a run on your employees. There's a couple others that a lot of churches use. Let me come up with a list maybe. I'll get them to Dwayne and he can send them out to everybody. But there are some resources like that that are really very important. Brotherhood Mutual, by the way, is an insurance company. They insure churches. They have a lot of resources on the sex offender thing, how to deal with it, what kind of agreements you need to have. You can go to brotherhoodmutual.com and find a lot of resources. Again, that's in the book, but in the short term, it's a good way to check that out. Let me tell you, I know this is not something that comes up in Bible school or seminary. It's just something we're going to have to learn in the digital age that we live in. It's just a big part of it.
Dwayne?
Microphone boy, get with it.
He's looking up the website. He's diligent. Speaking of being in this digital age, maybe shifting to when you're talking about social media and agreements of staff, what they're going to post, not only inappropriate things, but how do you deal with a common understanding of what hills we're going to die on? So political
Yeah.
comments, because I know that gets tricky because people say, oh, I've got free speech. I can say whatever I want to.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. You know, social media has done some wonderful things, and it's also done some horrible things. Horrible things. One of them is it's given people a voice that probably shouldn't have a voice out there. And that's a great example that everybody feels like, well, I've got an opinion, so I'm going to share it on social media. But this is an education issue, and this is why I think it's so important that you get your team and you train this. It might be good to do some teaching out of the book when you get it, because they need to understand that they're connected to your church. So even from a personal perspective on their social media, on their Facebook or whatever, everything they said, people are going to associate with, everything they say, they're going to associate with your church. And you can't police that 100%. You just have to be sensitive and careful. And I don't think you should be a Nazi about it and be a cop and really look over everybody's shoulder. They should have some freedom. But at the same time, I think it's important for them to know if they're going to be a mature Christian leader, they need to know that everything they say reflects. When do you become a liability? It's going to be different in different cases. Now, politics, every church is different, because I know some pastors that are really big on preaching on politics. Others avoid it like the plague. So that's something that I think you guys have to navigate individually with who you want to be out there.
Is some of the conversation around that, to that point, maybe you get your staff or whoever the influencers are within
Yeah.
your leadership team and have the conversation of just understand when you may be willing to die on this hill, you're asking us to die on it too.
Well, that's true.
So at least you're making them think it through
Yeah.
before they do it, because that's not dictating to them what they can and can't say, but it is making them aware
Yeah.
that you're asking us all to die on this hill.
Yeah, that's really true. Really, really true. And it's, I don't know, I could talk for hours on social media because it's got so many implications to it, but you understand that it's just, it can have a lot of problems. It can generate a lot of issues out there. I mean, I get flooded with porn on my social media sites for some reason. I guess you get up to a certain number of followers, and all the porn sites start, sending you stuff. So you just have to be super vigilant about that stuff. Super vigilant, and it's really, really hard. Really hard. I had and a lot of times it's innocent. I had a pastor and his wife went on a well-deserved trip to Hawaii. Anniversary trip. He took her to Hawaii. They're having a great time. They're at the pool, and they're fooling around, having some fun at the pool, taking pictures and posting them on Facebook. Well, he didn't notice that back at the other end of the pool is the pool bar. So in all the photos, it looks like they're in a bar having great fun, because there's liquor bottles all lined up behind them. It's in the distance, but on the picture it doesn't look like it. So I sent him a quick text, and I said, hey, you might want to rethink those pictures. And he was horrified when he actually looked at it and noticed and saw it. So sometimes it's innocent, and you never know. You just never, ever know. Any other thing? Any questions?
Some of you that aren't senior pastors, you can ask questions too. So I don't want you to think, oh, this is just limited to only pastors.
But don't expose your senior pastor if you have something on him.
We all know who they are anyway. So.
I'm just interested in your opinion when you post something and you have a hater come at you.
Okay. Great question. Great question. When you get critics on social media, let me give you, and here's the thing. If you're a church that's actually making any kind of impact in your community, you're going to get critics. You're going to get critics. I know churches that have an ex-church member or an ex-staff member who's decided to take out a Facebook page or a blog for the total purpose of destroying that church. Wow. Benny Perez in Vegas is this way. He's got a guy that he thinks was an ex-church member. They have a blog, and every Sunday, this guy blogs about all the terrible things about Benny's church. Totally unfounded. The guy's, just a jerk. It happens. And so we're going to get critics. So here's a couple things to think about with critics on social media. Number one, see how many followers they have before you respond. I said something on my blog recently, and a guy just lit into me on Twitter. Lit into me. Nasty, ugly stuff. I checked his followers. He's got 4 people that follow him. Probably his family. So if I respond to him, my 35,000 followers are going to be exposed to this idiot. So why even respond? So I didn't, and that probably made him more angry, but I just ignore him. Just ignore him. So think about that, number one. Number two, make sure that guy or woman has not misunderstood you. Sometimes what seems like a hostile response on social media, once I really look at it, okay, I think they just misunderstood what I was trying to say. And I can point that out rather than respond harshly to them or be ugly about it. I think that's really important, that you take the time, take a breath. Don't just respond quickly in your moment of anger. Take a breath and see. There's also a good technique if somebody does it regularly. My wife, because we travel so much, we're members of the American Airline Club, the Admirals Club, they call it. And because I can get a ton of work done there. And so my wife's membership came due one time, and I'd forgotten about it till the night before. It was the day it expired. And she had a big trip the next morning, super early, by herself. She was taking a trip to speak somewhere. And so I frantically called American the night before, and I said, look, here's my check, here's my credit card. I want to make sure my wife can get in at 5:30 in the morning when she gets to the airport. And she said, okay, no problem. We'll take it care of. It's in the computer. She said, in case it doesn't go live by tomorrow, print this out, and you can show it. So I gave it to my wife. She goes to the club the next morning at 5:30, and they wouldn't let her in. I went nuts. She called me, and I just went nuts. And I went on their Twitter account, American's Twitter account, and just blistered them. I've got this proof, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, immediately a girl responded and said, hey, I want to help. I can fix your problem. Why don't you call this number? She direct messaged me. She said, call this number, and I'll help you go through this. Well, guess what that did? Number one, it solved my problem. She got Kathy in. Number two, it took my criticism offline. The minute she said, direct message me or call this number, immediately my criticism went offline. So people didn't see me ripping American Airlines anymore. So there's some techniques you can do like that matter. Now, one thing to realize is in the harshest controversy sometimes isn't as big as we feel like it is. When you get I had a pastor in North Carolina that when he would get a critic online or on social media, it would paralyze him. It would just eat at him. He got to the point where he couldn't preach. It bothered him so much. But the truth is, it's not nearly as big as we think it is. We think it's, he's criticizing me. The world must be upset. No, they're not. I talked to the social media director of a Fortune 500 company. She said their company did a national television commercial that was not good. It was the wrong commercial to the wrong audience at the wrong time, and it unleashed a flood of critics. She said they had 7 social media people on duty 24/7 to deal with the responses. But she said, you know what? In 2 weeks, it went away. It's called the news cycle. Something else will come up, and people will forget. So don't feel like it's going to dog you for the rest of your life. It can come and it can go pretty quickly. So just be sensitive about how you respond and, be gentle, be devastatingly nice, but be devastating. No, I'm teasing.
How long is a normal news cycle? What would you say that is?
Let me tell you a story about the news cycle. Remember the name Mary, probably a lot of you younger ones don't remember, the name Mary Jo Kopechne? A young senator named Ted Kennedy went to a party one night with a lot of friends in New England, and he picked up a girl that was on the campaign staff, young girl, and he was married at the time. He picked up this young girl and started to drive her. They were going to go to her house. He had too much to drink. He missed the bridge, went off the bridge into the water. He managed to get out of the car. He left her and she drowned. He climbed out, walked back to the party, and they didn't even tell anybody till the next day. Here's a woman you just, for all practical purposes, killed in this accident underwater, and he didn't even alert anybody to the next day. It was a catastrophe on every level. He should have never, ever been allowed to run for office. He should have been humiliated. But guess what happened the next day? We landed on the moon. We landed on the moon. And Ted Kennedy went on to become a lifelong, his whole adult life he spent in the Senate. He was honored as the Lion of the Senate. You probably remember before he died. He was considered a hero. And yet, had it not been for the man on the moon, his career might have gone a dramatically different direction. News cycles happen, and they happen in a social media world today, they happen quicker than ever. And so that catastrophe, you think, isn't always going to last a long time. Does that make sense? It's important to know. You never know what's going to happen, so you have to be careful and be prepared, but it does happen. It does happen.
There we go. Okay, 2. Bob.
Yeah, who wants to go first?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, how do you get rid of bad Google reviews?
Bad what?
Google reviews.
Be better. No, I'm teasing. That's hard because it's very difficult. You could complain to Google or Yelp, whoever is, whatever the platform is. You can complain to them if you feel like it's really off base. My suggestion about that is whenever you get criticism, I always say the best way, you can hire a company that will get rid of that stuff, but it's super expensive, and Google does not like you fooling with it. And if they catch you fooling with it, they could take you off Google, which permanently makes you invisible. So my recommendation is flood it with good stuff. Flood it with good stuff. Encourage your congregation. Hey, if the service meant something to you today, talk about it on Facebook. If you got a blog, talk about it on your blog. Talk about it on social media. Share it with people. And the more good information that's out there, the bad information just gets pushed down and down and down. You really want it off the front page at least, the first page of search results. So the best advice, and it may take a little bit for that to happen, but flood the net with good stuff. That's the way to get rid of the bad stuff because it's really very difficult to get it off.
In dismissing staff or leaders.
Yes.
In this context, you said don't keep things secret, but at the same time, you have a legal responsibility. You have to fight the tension between awareness of the right people, but also exposure to legal responsibilities. So if you're dismissing a staff person, who is it that you bring into the group? And is it okay to keep it from maybe the rest of the congregation and that person leaves with their integrity? I use the phrase, because my board has asked me before, Pastor, how do you do this? I said, well, they get to tell the story, but we know the truth.
Yeah.
And I don't crush that person as they leave, but how do you actually show them?
That's a really good story, and I mean, a really good question. And it's interesting you say that because just, I think, about 6 months ago, there was a highly publicized story of a church that did that very thing. The man went on to other churches, only to find out 10 years later what this guy had done. And the congregation was outraged that they had not been told. The pastor was, I don't know if he was dismissed or not, but he was ridiculed because the church just felt, he did this and you never told us about this? So a lot of it depends on what's the level of wrongdoing he or she does. I think that's going to be important. But number one, my philosophy is we need to fire more people. I think churches need to fire more people. And I'll tell you why. we just think we're Christians, you know? We're supposed to be gracious and kind and loving. But the truth is, there's probably somebody in your staff who's a bottleneck, who's a huge problem. And we think, well, you know, I can't fire Brother Bob. You know, he's been with us forever. I know he's a problem, but he's been with us forever. You know, I can keep it quiet. Trust me, everybody in your staff knows Brother Bob is a problem, and it's creating bitterness. It's creating anger and frustration. I worked for a big national media ministry a number of years ago where I just could not get the leader to fire this one person. And I said, look, you'll do better if you send that person home at full salary. If you feel that guilty, keep paying them, but don't let them come to the office. So he did. Guess what? Productivity went through the roof. I mean, that whole ministry changed. Once they got that guy out of the office, everything changed. So I think we need to do that. Now, obviously, we need to be sensitive in how we do it. Don't kick people to the curb. Just help them find their gifting in a place where they can actually be used rather than where it is right now. I got fired. In 1991, I got fired, and it was, looking back, it was God that fired me. You know, I was so... I could rationalize anything, and I would have stayed there forever. I was in a good church. My kids were in a good school. I had my friends there. God had to step in there and fire me to make me fulfill what he called me to do. And so I think sometimes I've had people come back that I've fired on my team years later and say, thank you. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. I appreciate you doing that. So I think we need to get in a mindset where don't be afraid to, if they're a problem, we need to help them get plugged in where they can really succeed. But your attorney needs to be on that call, for one thing. Whenever you do, for sure, be on that call. And he'll know better at what level their problem was, whether it's worth revealing or not. And I also think the key thing to me is at least the people that deal in that area need to be told. You know, if it was something that involves kids or something that involves seniors or something else, and it was a safety issue or a moral issue, the people that are involved in that area, they need to probably be told what the deal is. But it's a good question. You want to be nice, you want to help them move on, and that's great. But my worry is, are they going to do that at the next place down the road? And at least, I've done this. I've had people call me who say, I'm about to hire this guy. You know, would you recommend him? And I said, no, I wouldn't. I actually wouldn't, and here's why. So I would be honest from that perspective. That makes sense? Okay.
That's good.
All right, thank you guys. I appreciate your help. Thanks, this is good.
We're going to actually take about a 15-minute break before our next session, so you guys can go get something to eat or drink or go to the restroom.
Or come up and yell at me if you didn't like what I said, what I talked about. There you go.